A quiet day shattered. The early afternoon sun painted a serene picture over the small town of Rivermount. Sidewalks bustled lightly with a mix of older residents taking leisurely strolls and younger folks hurrying through errands. Mr. Henry Carter, a 72-year-old retired school teacher, cherished such afternoons. Living through decades of societal changes, he had grown to appreciate life's quiet moments. His cane tapped lightly on the pavement as he made his way to the pharmacy for his heart medication. Henry carried himself with dignity, his neatly pressed shirt and well-polished shoes reflecting his pride in personal appearance. Henry's mind wandered as he walked. Memories of past struggles and triumphs filled his thoughts. Growing up during the civil rights movement had taught him resilience. Despite the systemic barriers he faced as a young black man, Henry had dedicated his life to education, believing in the power of knowledge to bridge divides. Yet in his twilight years, Henry often found himself questioning how far society had truly come. Today, however, those heavy thoughts were overshadowed by simple tasks. All he wanted was to pick up his prescription and perhaps indulge in a slice of pie at the nearby diner. The pharmacy was just a block away when Henry's path intersected with that of Officer Brian Kavanaugh. The officer, a large, imposing man with a steely gaze, had just exited a nearby gun shop. In his hand, he clutched a pair of steel knuckles he had recently purchased, an item that glimmered coldly in the sunlight. As Brian stepped out, Henry unintentionally brushed past him. It was a light, harmless collision, the kind that happens on crowded sidewalks every day. Brian, however, was not a man known for his patience. His temper, often concealed beneath the guise of authority, flared instantly. "Watch where you're going," he barked, his voice harsh and dripping with disdain. Henry stopped, turned slightly, and offered a polite apology. "I'm sorry, officer. Didn't mean to bump into you." But Brian wasn't interested in apologies. To him, Henry represented more than an accidental collision. He embodied decades of simmering prejudice Brian couldn't even articulate. Without another word, Brian raised the steel knuckles and struck Henry squarely in the face. The impact was swift and brutal. The sound of metal against flesh echoed through the street, drawing the attention of passersby. Henry crumpled to the ground, his cane clattering beside him. His glasses shattered upon impact, and a crimson streak of blood began to trail down his weathered cheek. The sidewalk seemed to tilt as he tried to process what had just happened. Pain radiated through his head, and the world around him blurred. Brian stood over Henry, his face devoid of remorse. If anything, there was a smug satisfaction in his expression. "Stay out of my way next time," he muttered, loud enough for the growing crowd to hear. Adjusting his belt, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Henry sprawled on the pavement. For a moment, the street was silent, the shock of what had occurred immobilizing everyone. Then, like ripples in a pond, murmurs of disbelief began to spread through the crowd. "Did you see that?" Someone whispered. "He just hit that old man and walked away," another voice exclaimed. One person, however, refused to stay frozen. Emily Rivera, a young woman in her late 20s, rushed to Henry's side. Emily worked as a freelance journalist and was no stranger to injustice. Her heart pounded as she knelt beside Henry, her hands trembling. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice quivering. Henry groaned softly, but didn't respond. Emily quickly retrieved her phone and dialed 911. "Emergency services," a calm voice answered. "There's been an assault," Emily blurted. "An elderly man's been attacked. He's bleeding and unconscious. We need help immediately. The corner of Pine and Maple. Please hurry." As Emily ended the call, others in the crowd began to step forward. Among them was Franklin Hayes, a middle-aged man who owned a nearby hardware store. Franklin's face was a storm of anger as he took in the scene. "What kind of man does this to an old-timer?" he demanded, his voice loud enough to gather attention. A few bystanders nodded in agreement, but others seemed hesitant. It wasn't just a random attacker. It was a police officer. Fear and uncertainty hung in the air, keeping some from speaking out. One man, however, began recording the scene on his phone. He captured the blood pooling on the pavement, Emily frantically trying to stop the bleeding with a handkerchief, and the unmistakable marks left by the steel knuckles. "People need to see this," the man muttered to himself. "They need to know what's happening." The wail of approaching sirens broke through the tense atmosphere. Within moments, an ambulance pulled up, and two paramedics rushed to Henry's side. Emily stepped back, her hands now stained with Henry's blood. "He was hit by a cop," she told the paramedics, her voice thick with emotion. "He just left him here." The paramedics exchanged grim looks but didn't comment. Their focus was on stabilizing Henry. As they worked, Franklin turned to the crowd. "We can't let this slide," he said, his voice firm. "We've got to report this. That cop needs to be held accountable." Some nodded in agreement, but others shuffled uncomfortably, unwilling to involve themselves further. Fear of retaliation from the police lingered in their minds. As the paramedics loaded Henry onto the stretcher, Emily made a silent vow. She had seen too many stories of abuse swept under the rug, too many moments where justice was denied. This time, she would make sure the world knew what had happened. She would not let Henry's story end on this blood-stained sidewalk. The ambulance doors closed with a metallic clang, and the vehicle sped toward the hospital. Emily stood rooted in place, her fists clenched. The image of Henry lying helpless on the ground was seared into her mind. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a deeper sickness in the system, a sickness she was determined to expose. As the crowd began to disperse, Emily glanced down at her phone. The video captured by the bystander had already been shared with her, and she had uploaded it to her social media accounts. Within minutes, notifications started flooding in, comments of outrage, messages of support, and, inevitably, a few voices of skepticism. Emily ignored the skeptics. She knew what she had seen, and she knew the truth. But as she watched the ambulance disappear down the street, she also knew this was only the beginning. What had started as a quiet afternoon had now become a battle for justice, one that would shake the foundations of Rivermount, and perhaps the entire nation. Ripples of injustice. The emergency room at Rivermount General Hospital was a whirlwind of activity, yet for Henry Carter, time felt suspended. The sterile scent of antiseptics and the hum of medical equipment filled the room as nurses moved around him, checking vitals and cleaning the wound on his forehead. The harsh fluorescent light above illuminated the bruises forming on his face, a painful reminder of the injustice he had just endured. His thoughts swirled in a fog of pain and disbelief, replaying the moment Officer Kavanaugh's fist, encased in steel knuckles, had struck him. Henry opened his eyes slightly, wincing as the movement sent waves of pain through his body. A young nurse named Clara hovered near his bedside, her face a mixture of compassion and concern. "Mr. Carter, you're in the hospital. You've been injured, but we're taking good care of you. Can you hear me?" Henry gave a faint nod. His voice was barely a whisper. "I can hear you. Thank you." Clara smiled softly, relieved to see him responsive. "Good. You're safe now, Mr. Carter. Try to rest." But safe was the last thing Henry felt. Despite the warmth of her words, the cold reality of what had happened gnawed at him. He wasn't just a man recovering from an attack. He was a symbol of something larger, a painful reminder that injustice had never truly left the world he thought had changed. Meanwhile, in another corner of town, Emily Rivera sat at her small kitchen table, her laptop open and her phone vibrating with endless notifications. The video she had posted of Henry's assault had gone viral faster than she anticipated. Within hours, the footage had been shared thousands of times, spreading across social media platforms like wildfire. The comments ranged from outrage to disbelief, with many demanding accountability and others questioning whether the video told the whole story. Emily scrolled through the messages, her heart racing. A few stood out. "This is horrifying. How can this still be happening in 2024? We need the name of this officer. People like him don't deserve to wear the badge. Another day, another abuse of power. When will this end? Are we sure the man wasn't resisting? There's always more to the story. The last comment made Emily's blood boil. She knew all too well how quickly narratives could be twisted to favor those in power. Resisting. She muttered under her breath. He's a 72-year-old man with a cane. Determined, Emily opened a blank document on her laptop and began drafting an article. As a journalist, she had written countless pieces on systemic issues, but this one felt personal. She titled it, "A Punch Heard Around the Nation. The Assault on Henry Carter." Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she outlined the details of the incident, from the casual brutality of Officer Kavanaugh's actions to the bystanders who bore witness. She included quotes from Franklin Hayes, who had reached out to her shortly after the ambulance left, and added her own reflections on the broader implications of the assault. As she wrote, she felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. This wasn't just about Henry. It was about every person who had ever suffered in silence, every act of violence that had gone unnoticed. At the same time, in a modest office on the outskirts of Rivermount, Officer Brian Kavanaugh sat at his desk, oblivious to the storm brewing outside. His uniform hung neatly on a rack behind him, and the steel knuckles rested in his drawer, their sheen dulled by the fluorescent light overhead. Brian leaned back in his chair, a smug grin tugging at the corners of his mouth as he replayed the encounter in his mind. To him, Henry Carter was just another nobody who had gotten in his way. Brian had been with the Rivermount Police Department for over a decade, and in that time, he had developed a reputation for being both efficient and ruthless. To his superiors, he was a man who got the job done. But to the community, he was a symbol of unchecked authority, a bully with a badge. Yet, despite numerous complaints over the years, nothing had ever stuck. Brian had mastered the art of dodging accountability, relying on the shield of his position to protect him from consequences. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, sitting up straighter. Sergeant Angela Peters stepped inside, her face serious. She held a tablet in her hand, the screen glowing with a paused video. "Brian," she began, her tone low but firm. "We need to talk." Brian raised an eyebrow, feigning ignorance. "About what?" Angela placed the tablet on his desk and hit play. The footage of Henry's assault filled the screen, the metallic impact of the steel knuckles audible even through the tinny speakers. As the video looped, Brian's smirk faded. He leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "Where'd you get this?" he asked. "It's all over social media," Angela replied. "The department's phones have been ringing nonstop. The mayor's office called twice already, and we're expecting a statement from the governor." Brian leaned back, crossing his arms. "It's not what it looks like," he said dismissively. "That old man bumped into me. He was being disrespectful." Angela stared at him, her expression unreadable. "Disrespectful? He's a 72-year-old retired teacher. The video shows you hitting him unprovoked. This isn't going to blow over, Brian. People are angry." Brian shrugged. "Let them be angry. It'll die down in a week, just like it always does." Angela's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not this time," she said quietly. "The man you hit isn't just anybody. His name is Henry Carter, and his son is Samuel Carter, the civil rights attorney who's been making headlines nationwide." Brian's face paled. He hadn't expected this. Back at the hospital, Henry stirred in his bed, his mind drifting between wakefulness and dreams. Memories of his youth resurfaced, vivid and raw. The marches, the chants, the endless struggle for dignity and equality. He had thought those days were behind him, that his later years would be free of such battles. But as he lay there, the weight of what had happened bore down on him. The door to his room opened, and Clara entered with a cautious smile. "Mr. Carter, there's someone here to see you." Henry's heart skipped a beat. He struggled to sit up, his body protesting with every movement. "Who is it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Clara stepped aside, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man in a tailored suit. His face was a mixture of determination and concern, his piercing eyes scanning the room until they landed on Henry. It was Samuel Carter, his son. "Dad," Samuel said, his voice trembling slightly as he rushed to Henry's side. "What happened to you?" Henry reached out, his weathered hand clasping Samuel's. "Son," he began, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't think I'd see the day when this would happen again." Samuel's jaw tightened as he looked at his father's bruised face. "You don't have to say anything, Dad. I already know." The two sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the situation settling between them. Finally, Samuel spoke. "I'm not just here as your son, Dad. I'm here as your advocate. That officer, Brian Kavanaugh, is going to face justice, and this time, he won't get away with it." Henry nodded slowly, his eyes brimming with tears. For the first time since the assault, a flicker of hope stirred within him. Samuel had always been a fighter, a man who had dedicated his life to standing up for the voiceless. And now, that fight would be for him. As news of the incident spread, the town of Rivermount found itself at the center of a national conversation. Protests began to form outside the police department, with signs demanding accountability and chants echoing through the streets. Social media exploded with calls for justice, and journalists from across the country descended on the small town. But amidst the chaos, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about Henry Carter. It was about a system that had allowed such injustices to persist for far too long. And with Samuel Carter leading the charge, Rivermount was about to become the epicenter of a reckoning that would send ripples across the nation. The call for justice. The streets of Rivermount had never seen anything like this. What was once a sleepy town, known for its quiet neighborhoods and unassuming charm, was now a hotbed of activism. Protesters of all ages and backgrounds flooded the sidewalks outside the Rivermount Police Department. They held signs reading, "Justice for Henry Carter," and "No more abuse of power." The air buzzed with energy as chants echoed through the streets. What do we want? Justice. When do we want it? Now. The viral video of Henry Carter's assault had ignited a firestorm of outrage. News vans lined the curbs, their cameras capturing every moment of the growing movement. Reporters from national networks interviewed bystanders and community leaders, while live streamers shared updates with audiences around the world. In the midst of the crowd, Emily Rivera stood on the steps of the police department, her voice amplified by a borrowed megaphone. What had started as a spontaneous act of compassion, helping Henry on the street, had evolved into a full-blown crusade for accountability. Emily's passion and determination had turned her into a reluctant leader of the movement. "This isn't just about Henry Carter," Emily declared, her voice strong despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "This is about every person who has ever been a victim of abuse, every family who has suffered in silence. We are here to demand change, and we will not back down until justice is served." The crowd roared in agreement. Behind Emily, Franklin Hayes stood tall, a protective presence. Franklin had been one of the first to demand answers after the assault, and now he was a key organizer in the fight. He leaned close to Emily, his deep voice cutting through the noise. "You've got them fired up, but we need to keep the pressure on. They'll try to wait us out, hope we lose steam." Emily nodded. She knew Franklin was right. Movements like these often faced opposition, not just from the authorities, but also from the fatigue that set in when change didn't come quickly. But Emily was determined to see this through, no matter how long it took. Inside the Rivermount Police Department, behind the reinforced glass of the station's windows, Officer Brian Kavanaugh paced back and forth. His usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by a scowl of frustration. He had underestimated the backlash his actions would provoke. The video had gone viral faster than he'd expected, and now his name was on everyone's lips. Across the room, Sergeant Angela Peters sat at her desk, watching the protests through the window. She had been in law enforcement for nearly 2 decades and had seen her fair share of controversies. But this was different. The evidence against Brian was damning, and the public outcry was unlike anything the department had faced before. Angela's phone buzzed on her desk, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a call from the mayor. "Yes, Mayor Caldwell," she answered, her tone professional. The voice on the other end was tense. "Sergeant Peters, we're getting hammered by the media. I've got reporters camped outside my office, the governor breathing down my neck, and half the town calling for Officer Kavanaugh's badge. What are you doing to address this?" Angela took a deep breath. "We've launched an internal investigation, and Officer Kavanaugh has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome." "That's not enough," the mayor snapped. "The people want action, Angela. They want justice. You need to handle this before it spirals further out of control." Angela clenched her jaw. She knew the mayor was right, but the wheels of justice turned slowly, especially when it came to holding police officers accountable. Still, she resolved to do what she could. "Understood, Mayor. I'll do everything in my power to ensure this is handled appropriately." As the call ended, Angela glanced at Brian, who had stopped pacing and was now glaring at her. "What?" he asked, his tone defensive. "You're in deep, Brian," Angela said bluntly. "This isn't going away. If I were you, I'd start preparing for the worst." Brian sneered. "I didn't do anything wrong. That old man bumped into me. He should have watched where he was going." Angela's eyes narrowed. "You assaulted a 72-year-old man with steel knuckles. That's not just excessive force. That's criminal. And the whole world has seen it." Brian muttered something under his breath and stormed out of the room. Angela watched him go, her frustration mounting. She knew the department's reputation was on the line, and she wasn't sure how much longer they could contain the fallout. At the hospital, in a private hospital room, Henry Carter sat upright in bed, his face still bruised and bandaged, but his spirit unbroken. Beside him, his son Samuel Carter, a prominent civil rights attorney, reviewed a stack of legal documents. Samuel's presence was a comfort to Henry, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. "Dad," Samuel said, looking up from the papers, "I've filed a formal complaint with the department and initiated a lawsuit against Officer Kavanaugh and the Rivermount Police Department. We're also pushing for criminal charges." Henry nodded, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "Thank you, son. This isn't just for me. It's for everyone who's been wronged and didn't have a voice." Samuel placed a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. "We're going to make sure your voice is heard, Dad. This isn't just about holding one officer accountable. It's about changing the system that allows this kind of abuse to happen." As they spoke, a nurse entered the room with a tablet. "Mr. Carter," she said, smiling warmly, "you've got quite the support network out there. People from all over the country have been sending messages of encouragement. Would you like to see some?" Henry hesitated, then nodded. The nurse handed him the tablet, and Samuel helped him scroll through the messages. Each one was a testament to the impact his story had made. "Stay strong, Mr. Carter. We're with you. Thank you for standing up to injustice. You're an inspiration. We demand accountability. Justice for Henry Carter." Tears welled up in Henry's eyes as he read the words of support. He had spent his life fighting for equality and dignity, but he had never imagined he would become a symbol of resistance in his later years. "I just hope this leads to real change," he murmured. "It will," Samuel assured him. "But change doesn't come without a fight, and we're just getting started." In the court of public opinion, as the protests continued to grow, the media coverage intensified. News anchors debated the implications of the assault. Legal experts weighed in on the potential charges against Officer Kavanaugh, and activists used the moment to highlight broader issues of systemic injustice. Emily Rivera's article had gained national attention, cementing her role as a key voice in the movement. In interviews, she spoke passionately about the need for accountability and reform. "Henry Carter's story is not an isolated incident," she told one reporter. "It's part of a larger pattern of abuse and impunity within law enforcement. We can't just demand justice for Henry. We have to demand systemic change. Her words resonated with audiences, sparking conversations in households and communities across the country. People began sharing their own stories of injustice, creating a groundswell of solidarity that extended far beyond Rivermount. The turning point. As the movement gained momentum, pressure mounted on local officials to act. The Rivermount Police Department announced that Officer Kavanaugh would face disciplinary action and that an independent review board would investigate the assault. But for many, this was only the first step. Samuel Carter held a press conference outside the hospital, flanked by his legal team and community leaders. "We are here to demand not just accountability for Officer Kavanaugh, but also meaningful reform within the Rivermount Police Department," Samuel declared. "This incident has exposed deep flaws in the system, and we will not rest until those flaws are addressed." The crowd erupted in applause, their chants of "Justice for Henry" ringing out once more. For Henry Carter, who watched the press conference from his hospital bed, the sound was a balm for his pain. It was a reminder that his fight was not in vain, and that his story had become a catalyst for change. Justice in action. The courtroom was packed. Rows of pew-like benches were filled with community members, activists, reporters, and those simply curious to witness history in the making. The air was heavy with anticipation. Every creak of the wooden benches and shuffle of papers magnified in the tense silence. It had been a week since Henry Carter's brutal assault went viral, and today marked the beginning of the legal battle that would determine not just the fate of Officer Brian Kavanaugh, but also the credibility of the Rivermount Police Department. At the front of the courtroom sat Judge Eleanor Monroe, a seasoned adjudicator with a reputation for impartiality and firmness. Her gavel rested beside her as she adjusted her glasses and scanned the room. To her left, the prosecution team, led by Samuel Carter, stood ready. To her right, Brian Kavanaugh's defense attorney, a polished man in a tailored suit named James Forrester, shuffled through his notes. Seated in the audience, Henry Carter adjusted his glasses, still bearing the scars of the assault. Beside him, Emily Rivera and Franklin Hayes offered quiet encouragement. Though Henry's body was still healing, his spirit was resolute. He had lived through worse in his lifetime. But this moment felt different. It was a stand not just for himself, but for justice. The opening salvos. Samuel Carter approached the bench with a confidence born from years of fighting for civil rights. Dressed in a crisp navy suit, his every movement commanded attention. The courtroom fell silent as he began his opening statement. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Samuel said, his voice steady and deliberate. "We are here today because a sworn officer of the law, someone entrusted to protect and serve, brutally assaulted an elderly man, a retired educator, a community leader, and most importantly, a father. This case is not just about Henry Carter. It's about accountability, about ensuring that no one, regardless of their title or badge, is above the law." Samuel paused, letting his words sink in. He then gestured toward Henry. "My father survived segregation, marches for civil rights, and the trials of raising a family in a world that often saw him as less than. But never did he think he would face such blatant abuse in the twilight of his life." The jury members listened intently, their expressions serious. Samuel continued, outlining the evidence, the viral video, the eyewitness accounts, the medical reports detailing Henry's injuries, and the history of complaints against Officer Kavanaugh. By the time he returned to his seat, the mood in the courtroom was heavy. Next, James Forrester rose. His demeanor was calm, almost casual, as he began his statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I understand the outrage surrounding this case, but I urge you to focus on the facts, not the emotions. My client, Officer Brian Kavanaugh, acted in the heat of the moment, in a situation that could have easily been misinterpreted. We will prove that this incident was not a deliberate act of malice, but a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by the court of public opinion." His words stirred murmurs in the audience. Emily clenched her fists, her frustration palpable. She had seen firsthand the lack of remorse in Kavanaugh's eyes as he walked away from Henry's bloodied body. Misunderstanding, she thought. This was no misunderstanding. The evidence unfolds. As the trial progressed, Samuel meticulously presented his case. The first piece of evidence was the video that had sparked nationwide outrage. Played on a large screen for all to see, it captured the brutal moment when Kavanaugh struck Henry with the steel knuckles, the sickening sound of impact, and the officer's callous departure. The courtroom was silent as the video played. Even Judge Monroe, known for her stoic demeanor, appeared visibly unsettled. When the video ended, Samuel turned to the jury. "You've seen it for yourselves," he said. "This is not the behavior of a protector or a public servant. This is the behavior of a man who abused his power and left an innocent man to bleed on the street." Next, Samuel called witnesses to the stand. Emily Rivero was among the first. She recounted the events of that fateful day, her voice steady despite the emotions simmering beneath the surface. "I saw him hit Mr. Carter," she said, her gaze unwavering. "There was no provocation, no justification. Officer Kavanaugh didn't even hesitate. He just walked away like nothing had happened." Franklin Hayes followed, his testimony equally damning. "I've lived in Rivermount my whole life," he said. "I've seen my fair share of police misconduct, but this was different. It wasn't just excessive, it was inhumane." The prosecution also presented Henry's medical records, which detailed the extent of his injuries: a fractured cheekbone, a concussion, and severe bruising. A medical expert testified that the injuries were consistent with a deliberate, forceful blow. The defense struggles. James Forrester's defense hinged on casting doubt. He questioned the reliability of eyewitness accounts, suggesting that emotions and preconceived biases might have clouded their judgment. He argued that the video, while compelling, did not capture the full context of the encounter. Officer Kavanaugh was exiting the gun shop in a high-stress environment. Forrester said during cross-examination, "The bump could have been perceived as a threat. Officers are trained to react quickly in such situations." But his attempts to paint Kavanaugh as a victim of circumstance faltered under scrutiny. The prosecution introduced evidence of Kavanaugh's history of complaints, including multiple allegations of excessive force. Though none had led to disciplinary action, the pattern was clear. When Kavanaugh himself took the stand, his testimony was riddled with contradictions. Under Samuel's cross-examination, the officer's facade of confidence began to crack. "Officer Kavanaugh," Samuel said, his tone measured but firm, "can you explain why, after striking Mr. Carter, you chose to leave him bleeding on the ground rather than render aid?" Kavanaugh hesitated, his eyes darting toward his attorney. I didn't think he was seriously hurt." "You didn't think a 72-year-old man who collapsed and began bleeding immediately after being struck was seriously hurt?" Samuel pressed. "Or did you simply not care?" The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Kavanaugh's silence spoke volumes. The verdict looms. As the trial drew to a close, both sides presented their closing arguments. Samuel Carter spoke with the same passion and conviction that had defined his career. "This case is a test of our values," he told the jury. "It's a chance to prove that justice is not reserved for the powerful, that no badge grants immunity from accountability. Henry Carter deserves justice, and so does every person who has ever suffered at the hands of someone who abused their authority." James Forrester, meanwhile, implored the jury to consider the burden of proof. "My client's actions, while regrettable, do not rise to the level of criminal intent. You must ask yourselves, is there reasonable doubt?" The jury deliberated for hours, their decision hanging over the courtroom like a storm cloud. Outside, the protests continued, the chants growing louder as the community awaited the verdict. A nation watches. When the jury finally returned, the room was so silent that even the creak of the foreperson's chair seemed deafening. Judge Monroe addressed the jury. "Have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a calm but resolute expression, stood. "We have, Your Honor." In that moment, The weight of Henry Carter's ordeal, the protests, the viral video, and the legal arguments converge. The nation held its breath as the verdict was read, knowing that the outcome would resonate far beyond the walls of this courtroom. The verdict and the fallout. The courtroom was electric with tension, a powder keg of emotion ready to ignite as the jury foreperson rose to deliver the verdict. Henry Carter sat rigid in his chair, the lines of his face etched with both pain and resolve. Beside him, his son Samuel rested a steadying hand on his shoulder. Behind them, a sea of community members, activists and reporters leaned forward, holding their breath. Emily Rivera and Franklin Hayes exchanged a glance, silently willing the outcome to reflect the justice they had been fighting for. Judge Eleanor Monroe's voice broke through the silence. "Foreperson, please read the verdict." The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a steady voice but trembling hands, unfolded the piece of paper. Her eyes scanned the words, and she took a breath before speaking. "On the charge of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, we find the defendant, Officer Brian Kavanaugh, guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Henry's hand flew to his mouth, his eyes filling with tears as Samuel tightened his grip on his father's shoulder. Franklin let out a low, triumphant whistle, and Emily blinked rapidly, willing herself not to cry. The judge's gavel struck the wooden block, demanding order, but the murmurs of relief and vindication in the gallery were unstoppable. The foreperson continued. "On the charge of misconduct in public office, we find the defendant guilty." This time, the reaction was louder. Applause began to break out before Judge Monroe raised her voice. "I will have order in this courtroom." The gallery quickly quieted, though the sense of triumph lingered in the air. Officer Kavanaugh sat at the defendant's table, his face pale and expression blank. His attorney, James Forrester, leaned in to whisper something, but Kavanaugh didn't respond. The man who had strutted through Rivermount with unchecked authority now looked like a ghost of himself. Judge Monroe turned her attention to Kavanaugh. "Brian Kavanaugh, you have been found guilty on both counts. Sentencing will occur in 2 weeks, but let me make one thing clear. This court does not take lightly the abuse of power by those sworn to protect and serve. You will be held accountable for your actions." With another strike of the gavel, the judge adjourned the proceedings. As people began to file out, the weight of the moment settled over the courtroom. For Henry Carter, it felt like a lifetime of struggle had led to this point, a small but significant step toward justice. The reaction outside. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of hundreds waited anxiously. As news of the guilty verdict spread, a roar of applause and cheers erupted. People hugged, cried, and raised their fists in the air. Signs bearing slogans like "Justice for Henry" and "Accountability" now waved above the crowd, their messages resonating more powerfully than ever. Emily stepped onto the courthouse steps, phone in hand, live streaming the scene for her growing audience. "The jury has spoken," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Brian Kavanaugh has been found guilty. This is not just a victory for Henry Carter. It's a victory for everyone who believes in justice, accountability, and the idea that no one is above the law." The live-stream chat exploded with comments. "Finally, some accountability in this broken system. This is just the beginning. We need more wins like this. Henry Carter is a hero. Stay strong, sir." Franklin joined Emily, his broad frame towering over her. "We've won this round," he said, his voice low but resolute. "But this fight isn't over. This is just one cop. The system that enabled him is still standing." Emily nodded. She knew Franklin was right. The verdict was a milestone, not a finish line. There were still reforms to push for, policies to change, and a culture of impunity to dismantle. Henry's reflection. Later that evening, back in the quiet of his hospital room, Henry Carter sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. The bandages on his face itched, but he hardly noticed. His mind was on the day's events, the courtroom, the verdict, the cheers of the crowd outside. Samuel sat beside him, a notebook open on his lap. He had spent the last hour jotting down ideas for the next steps, advocating for federal oversight of the Rivermount Police Department, filing civil lawsuits, and drafting proposals for community-driven policing initiatives. But for now, he put his pen down, sensing his father needed a moment. "Dad," Samuel said softly, "how are you feeling?" Henry didn't answer right away. He turned to face his son, his eyes misty but clear. "I feel tired," he admitted, "but I also feel proud, not for myself, but for everyone who stood up and refused to let this be swept under the rug. I've seen too many people suffer in silence. Today, we didn't let that happen." Samuel reached for his father's hand. "You were the reason, Dad. You were the spark that lit this fire." Henry shook his head. "No, son. The spark was always there. I just happened to be the one holding it when the time came." The national conversation. As the days passed, Henry Carter's story continued to dominate headlines. Cable news networks ran panels discussing the implications of the verdict, with experts weighing in on the broader issues of police accountability and systemic reform. Social media was flooded with messages of support for Henry and calls for action against police brutality. The trial also inspired a wave of activism. Across the country, communities held rallies and town hall meetings, demanding changes to policing practices and greater transparency. Henry's name became a rallying cry, his face, a dignified portrait taken during his teaching days, emblazoned on posters and banners. But with the attention came resistance. Conservative pundits and police unions pushed back, framing the trial as an example of anti-police hysteria, and accusing the Carter family of exploiting the situation for personal gain. Some even questioned the fairness of the trial, despite the overwhelming evidence against Kavanaugh. Henry watched these debates with a mix of frustration and resolve. He knew the road to change would be long and arduous, but he also knew that progress never came without resistance. Samuel's next steps. 1 week after the verdict, Samuel Carter held a press conference on the steps of Rivermount City Hall. Flanked by community leaders, activists, and legal experts, he announced the formation of the Henry Carter Justice Initiative, a nonprofit organization dedicated to fighting police brutality and advocating for systemic reform. "Our goal is simple," Samuel said, his voice firm and clear. "To ensure that what happened to my father never happens to anyone else. This isn't just about holding individuals accountable. It's about transforming the system that allows these abuses to occur." The initiative's first actions included lobbying for body camera mandates, independent review boards for police misconduct, and increased funding for community-led safety programs. Within days, donations poured in from across the country, and volunteers signed up to join the fight. A symbol of hope. For Henry, the weeks following the trial were a whirlwind of emotions. He received countless letters from strangers thanking him for his courage and sharing their own stories of injustice. Though the physical scars of the assault would take time to heal, the emotional scars seemed lighter knowing that his experience had sparked meaningful change. One evening, as he sat in his favorite chair, Samuel handed him a framed article from a national newspaper. The headline read, "The Man Who Sparked a Movement. Henry Carter's Fight for Justice." Below it was a photo of Henry, his eyes filled with quiet strength. Henry traced the frame with his fingers, a small smile playing on his lips. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said softly. "But if it helps even one person, it was worth it." The legacy grows. The verdict marked a turning point for Rivermount and beyond. While the fight for justice was far from over, Henry Carter's story became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage and perseverance could prevail. And as Henry Carter looked out at the world from his small home in Rivermount, he knew one thing for certain: his journey wasn't over. He wasn't just a victim of injustice. He was a survivor, a teacher, and now, a symbol of a movement that was just beginning to rise. A movement unfolds. Months had passed since the verdict that found Officer Brian Kavanaugh guilty of the assault on Henry Carter. What began as an isolated act of brutality in a quiet town had snowballed into a nationwide reckoning with the abuses of power entrenched in law enforcement. For Henry, the physical pain had largely subsided, though the scars remained, both on his body and in his soul. Yet, as he sat on the porch of his modest home in Rivermount, he found solace in knowing that his suffering had sparked something far greater than himself. A movement. The birth of a movement. The Henry Carter Justice Initiative, HCJI, spearheaded by Samuel Carter, had rapidly gained traction. Offices had been set up in cities across the country, staffed by lawyers, activists, and volunteers who were committed to addressing police misconduct and systemic injustice. HCJI's mission went beyond high-profile cases like Henry's. It worked to bring justice to those whose stories had been buried, families mourning loved ones, communities grieving over lost trust. One of HCJI's flagship programs was a legal defense fund aimed at providing resources to victims of police misconduct. The initiative also began compiling a national database of complaints against officers, something that had been sorely lacking in the fragmented law enforcement system. The database aimed to prevent officers with histories of misconduct from simply transferring to new departments, a practice commonly known as badge hopping. But HCJI didn't stop at litigation. The organization launched community outreach programs, training citizens to understand their rights during police encounters. It partnered with local schools to educate young people about civic engagement and the importance of accountability in public institutions. And perhaps most ambitiously, it began lobbying for national legislation to overhaul policing standards across the country. Rivermount as ground zero. Rivermount had become the epicenter of the movement, drawing activists, journalists, and politicians from across the country. The small town, once synonymous with quiet anonymity, was now a symbol of change. The local government faced mounting pressure to enact reforms, and Samuel Carter worked tirelessly to ensure those changes were more than superficial. At a town hall meeting packed with residents and reporters, Samuel addressed the crowd. "We don't want apologies," he said, his voice carrying the weight of conviction. "We don't want promises that things will change only for the status quo to return once the cameras are gone. We want transparency. We want accountability. And we want to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the community." Samuel's words were met with thunderous applause. Rivermount had already seen some changes. Officer Kavanaugh's conviction had spurred the resignation of the police chief, and a civilian oversight board was in the process of being formed. But Samuel and HCJI were pushing for deeper reforms, including mandatory de-escalation training for officers, bans on certain forms of force, and the introduction of body cameras for all patrols. Not everyone welcomed the changes. The local police union pushed back hard, accusing HCJI of undermining the department's ability to do its job. Conservative media outlets amplified these criticisms, painting Rivermount as a town in chaos. But the majority of the town's residents stood with Henry and Samuel, believing that the cost of inaction was far greater than the discomfort of reform. Henry's new role. While Samuel was busy with the legal and political battles, Henry found himself thrust into a role he had never anticipated, that of an activist. Invitations to speak poured in from universities, conferences, and even international human rights organizations. Though Henry was initially hesitant, Samuel encouraged him to share his story, reminding him of the power it held. At his first public appearance, a rally in Chicago attended by over 10,000 people, Henry stepped up to the microphone with trembling hands. The crowd erupted in applause, their energy washing over him like a wave. He took a deep breath and began. "I never thought I'd find myself here," he said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I'm just an old man from Rivermount who wanted to pick up his medicine. But what happened to me that day wasn't just about me. It was about a system that's been broken for far too long. And now, with all of you here, I know we can fix it." The crowd roared, and Henry's confidence grew with each speech. He became a symbol of resilience and hope, his story inspiring others to come forward with their own experiences of injustice. For Henry, The work was exhausting but deeply fulfilling. He had spent his life teaching young minds, and now he was teaching the world that change was possible. Opposition and threats. With the movement gaining momentum, opposition grew fiercer. Online trolls flooded social media with hateful messages aimed at discrediting Henry and HCGI. Conspiracy theories circulated, accusing Samuel of using his father's story for political gain or even fabricating parts of the incident. More troubling were the threats, anonymous letters and emails that grew increasingly violent. One evening, as Henry and Samuel reviewed plans for an upcoming HCGI summit, a brick crashed through the window of Henry's home, landing on the living room floor with a thud. Attached to it was a note scrawled in red ink. "Stay out of our town or else." Samuel's face darkened as he picked up the note. "They're scared," he said, his voice low but resolute. "Scared of losing the power they've abused for so long." Henry's hand trembled as he reached for his son's shoulder. "Don't let this stop you, Samuel. Don't let them win." The next day, HCGI filed a report with the FBI, and the local police, now under interim leadership, pledged to investigate. But Samuel knew this was part of a larger struggle. "When you fight for change," he told his father later that night, "you make enemies. But we can't let them intimidate us." A national reckoning. As Rivermount continued to grapple with its own transformation, the ripple effects of Henry's story were felt nationwide. Cities across the country began adopting reforms inspired by HCGI's work. Civilian oversight boards became more common, and state legislatures passed bills aimed at increasing transparency in policing. The federal government also took notice. A congressional committee invited Samuel and Henry to testify about their experiences and the broader issues of systemic injustice. In a packed hearing room, Henry shared his story once more, his voice calm but firm. "I am not here for revenge," he said. "I am here for accountability, for justice, and for a future where no one has to endure what I went through." Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle praised Henry's courage, though the path to comprehensive reform remained fraught with political challenges. Still, the seeds had been planted, and the conversation was no longer one that could be ignored. A community transformed. Back in Rivermount, life began to take on a new rhythm. The town was no longer defined by the events of Henry's assault, but by the changes those events had sparked. The Civilian Oversight Board was fully operational, and its members, chosen from a diverse cross-section of the community, worked tirelessly to ensure accountability. The Rivermount Police Department underwent a complete overhaul. New officers were required to undergo implicit bias training, and body cameras became standard equipment. Officers who had long abused their power quietly retired or faced disciplinary action. For the first time in years, trust between the police and the community began to grow. Henry often walked through town, his cane tapping against the pavement, a quiet smile on his face as he saw the changes around him. Children waved to him, calling out, "Hi, Mr. Carter." Adults stopped to thank him, sometimes with tears in their eyes. For the first time in a long while, Henry felt a deep sense of peace, the legacy of justice. As the years passed, the movement born in Rivermount spread far beyond its borders. The Henry Carter Justice Initiative became a cornerstone of the fight for police reform, its work saving countless lives and reshaping communities. Henry's story was taught in schools, his name etched in history alongside other champions of justice. For Henry, the accolades and recognition were never the goal. Sitting on his porch in the golden light of a summer evening, he watched as a group of children played in the street, their laughter filling the air. He thought about the world they were growing up in, still imperfect, still scared by injustice, but undeniably better than it had been. As Samuel joined him, a stack of papers in hand, Henry reached over and patted his son's arm. "You did good, son," he said softly. "We did good." Samuel smiled. "We're not done yet, Dad, but we're getting there." And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Henry Carter knew that while the fight for justice was far from over, the movement they had started would continue to grow, lighting the way for generations to come.